It's a beautiful presentation, but I'll make it more of a conversation, and I think it'll make it work. Okay. So I decided to write this book in the dark days of COVID, when I found myself in a email conversation with a bunch of vaunted visionaries and leading academics in the area of sustainability. And they started to wax, quite frankly, a little bit over dramatic about the importance of education and consciousness raising with regarding the climate crisis or whatever. And at some point, Bill Reese weighed in. You would have a nice picture on the screen now, Bill Reese, but he's really a great ecologist from the University of British Columbia. He invented ecological footprint theory. And what Bill Reese basically said was, guys, you need to get real. We aren't going to solve the climate crisis by education or anything else. It's going to take technology. And I'll tell you why I know this. Because look at this group. There's no group of academics, and was writing by email, who is more aware of the climate change's disastrous impacts on the ecological supporting services of the planet. And yet I ask you, how many of you who are so aware of this ever gave up a transcontinental flight because it was bad for the earth? And I'm not being sanctimonious. He said, I'm just as hypocritical as the next person. I take flights all the time and find the rationalizations. But if we, who are sort of the ecologists and have a real insights in what's happening, are not willing to compromise our mobility, what do we expect from the general public? And so it's going to take, putting hydrogen into airplanes or some other biofuels or something, or batteries even, to save the planet if we need to do that. And so we should really get with the business of creating policies that allow people to be innovative in the climate space. And that resonated with me because a day doesn't go by when I don't have some sense of my own inconsistencies environmentally. And I was well aware of the fact that the International Energy Agency from the UN has said that about 50% of the different technologies that we're going to need to reach net zero by 2050 had not yet been invented. In other words, the low-hanging fruit involves sort of an energy transition in terms of the maybe shifting to renewable sources, but there's so many things like the so-called 8 horsemen of the apocalypse, cement and steel and shipping, and there's just a list of different plastics and aviation. These are things that we're going to need to have serious climate innovation. So basically, we find ourselves in sort of a race, a two-tiered race. On the one hand, we need to very, very, very effectively reduce emissions, but at the same time, we need to create policies which provide the tailwinds or the incentives for entrepreneurs and for people. And this matters a lot in the battery space because, quite frankly, when we think about where we need to be, in particular, looking at the global south, or in general, to make the world's economy the decarbonized grid we need, it's going to have a huge contribution from the battery space. And quite frankly, we're not there yet completely. So as we look forward to what we might be doing as an economy, I wrote a book about it and taught a course, which I think is a pretty popular course at Stanford University for the past several years. So what I want to do is talk without data PowerPoint, happily so, about a few of the chapters. You won't get to hear about the power of procurement and nudges and things like that, but I do want to talk generally, first of all, about the general philosophy of why we need policies which provide incentives for people. A lot of people don't believe that government should be involved in the technology space at all. And what do we think about that? And then talk about sort of 3 areas. One is sort of monetizing carbon. What do we know about carbon taxes? There's been 61 countries that have adopted them. They don't work well. Why not? We should understand this. And then about what has worked in terms of the incentives, both in terms of feed-in tariffs and other tax exemptions, and what we can learn about that in general, and then perhaps more specifically with regard to the battery area. And finally, I'd like to talk a little bit about technology forcing policies, which have been very, very successful in other environmental realms. And we're seeing the first signs of them happening in the climate space and what they might mean. So I'll do that for about 15 minutes, maybe 10, 15 minutes, and then we'll just open up to discussion. I think that should be enough. And we're honored to have Michael here, who's the Volta Foundation leading spirit. And thank you so much for honoring us with your presence. So look, when we talk about public policy and climate, there are 2 schools of thought with regard to innovation. On the one hand, you have sort of what's called the push supplying, okay? The technology push, where we're going to provide incentives and research grants and all kinds of support by the government to create the new technologies that we're going to need to decarbonize society. The alternative perspective is what's called demand pull. Government should not be helping at the supply side. Create the demand for the actual product, either through whatever government intervention you want, and let the private market work. And the truth of the matter is, it's a false dilemma. I believe both of them should work. But I want to start with a few words about this notion of the how do you jumpstart research? How are we going to provide incentives from a policy perspective? Because the first point that I think is fairly self-evident for anybody who's ever been an entrepreneur is that the invisible hand of the market, and certainly the considerations of the VC investor, are such that basically we're not going to get to the optimal level of support for research. There are short-term pressures. Investors want to get their money back within 5-6 years, and generally transformational climate technology is going to take at least 10 or more so. There's huge uncertainties. Just look at the November election, and a lot of VCs just don't want to take that kind of a leap of faith when they don't know what's going on. And of course, there's the problem of the moats, that we have a hard time over such a long period of time preventing knowledge spillover. So we've seen that that there has been there, but there are a lot of people with a legitimate sort of more of a, I would say, libertarian economic philosophy, don't think government should be in the technology policy business in the first place. They say, look, government officials don't have the same kind of liability that you'd find amongst venture capitalists or any kind of bank. And so they're going to make sloppy decisions, and they're not going to have the same kind of, I would say, clear, economically sensible decisions. And so by definition, if a venture was economically competitive, it made sense economically, it wouldn't need to go for government grants. It could just get money from the private sector. And basically, they see government involvement as undermining the rough and tumble of the marketplace. Okay. Now, if I thought any of those three arguments had any virtue or volition, I would probably not have written the book. But I think that they don't make a lot of sense. And not just I don't think so. The first person to really make the point that we need to do better was Alexander Hamilton, the man who designed the American economic system. And he wrote very early on about America's need to compete with Europe as a young country. And he said, we need to cast aside laissez-faire orthodoxy. And just like governments get involved in human capital and help educational institutions, and we help with natural resources, innovation is a natural resource. And so if you look around the world all over, we're finding a whole series of different agencies emerging, which will allow countries to compete successfully in this massive race to produce the kind of technologies we're going to need in our new economy. So now the question is, at what point does the government want to be involved? And I'm sure you're all familiar with what's called TRL, or technology readiness levels, where NASA designed this in the 1970s. But generally, governments traditionally have only made investments at the early stages. It's sort of what they call the pipeline, sending money into basic research of universities. What makes climate tech and the battery space so different is that as you move up the TRL to feasibility and demonstration and development, you reach valleys of death very frequently. And government involvement has to be much further and later on, which makes it more expensive. But we've learned from the past that that's going to happen. And so governments have developed grants programs and loans and tax exemptions and provided government laboratories with support and created incubators and accelerators and just made direct investments in many countries in promising startups. And those are policies which make sense. The thing you need to remember, and that sometimes makes these problematic, is that governments make mistakes, and we're talking about uncertainty here. So when we look at something like the Norwegian experience, they invested hundreds of millions of dollars to create the single most carbon capture successful, the ambitious program. And in the end, the prime minister said it was going to be their moon landing. And in the end, they didn't capture a single gram of carbon. They spent fourfold beyond what they were supposed to, crossing the €1 billion mark. And although they didn't make any carbon capture, a lot of academic articles written, and it was sort of a bust. And these things happen. They happen in the United States. If anybody remembers the Solyndra solar debacle, 2011, when Barack Obama was running the stimulus program and $525 million of the American taxpayers' money went to guarantee a loan that eventually collapsed, and when the Solyndra went bankrupt. But at the very same time, and we're here in a battery place, so it's a good place to talk about it, Tesla, 2009, the government offers a $465 million loan guarantee to a failing car company. Within 4 years, they have Motor Trends of the Year, batteries are revolutionized, and the loan was returned in full by 2018. So the point is that you're going to have to take chances, and politically it's hard for governments to take the hit, but I think if we're really serious about it, and one of the things I do in this book of mine, Making Climate Tech Work, is do a deep dive into Denmark, which I think is punched way above its weight for years. I think you are maybe aware of over 50% of the wind energy produced today comes from turbines that are made by Danish companies, even though it's a country of less than 6 million people. And they've done that by being very smart in the way they design their support to their entrepreneurs, their academics. So by 200 million euros alone, they have really stayed competitive and are moving into other areas. So when I talked to the head of their innovation institute, or their company, that the guy who runs it, who was for many years running their largest wind energy company, should governments be agnostic or prescriptive? He said governments should prioritize technologies, but never target the necessarily recipients. The winners should never call the winners. Now, I want to talk a little bit about monetizing carbon, because one of the things that you teach over the years when you think about climate policy is that we should be providing a Pigovian tax. Those are sin taxes. Andrew Pigo was Arthur Pigo from Cambridge University 100 years ago, talked about the importance of putting taxes on bad things, not good things. Don't put taxes on labor and give people, income tax. Rather, you should put them on bad things like cigarettes or alcohol or the like. And carbon was one of those. And so this was sort of a theoretical notion until British Columbia in 2008 made the first carbon tax in a major scale in any way. And it was unlikely because the politician Gordon Campbell did. It was a conservative politician, but he was very environmentally committed. And he made a tax which did all the things right. If you read the economics literature, he started low at $10 a ton and raised it $5 a year. It was mostly a gasoline tax. And then he promised that this would be a revenue neutral tax. In other words, that if they took more taxes from the public, they'd return the same income to people, to either the business sector, which was supporting him, who are paying more through their carbon expenses, and of course the disenfranchised, weaker elements of poor populations. And the results were at first breathtaking. The GDP of British Columbia sailed up, population grew, was doing great, but overall fuel consumption was going down, and it looked like there was dropping in their carbon footprint. So everybody thought, wow, this is great. And for years I would teach this as really successful policy. But unfortunately, as the years went by, we saw that the enthusiasm sort of shifted. In the recent years, you have some new research coming out of the University of Victoria in Canada, which suggests that, in fact, it's not a success. They used a study called Difference in Different Studies, where they compared the provinces of Canada to British Columbia and found that, in fact, the initial drop was followed by an increase, and today any gains made have increased. We see that compared to the other 10 provinces, actually British Columbia's performance climate-wise have been weaker. And the question is why? So the answer to my mind is fairly clear, that when you look at what happened in the gasoline market, which is really the heart of their carbon tax, the fluctuations have been dramatic. After the Russian invasion of the Ukraine, you saw a market that really was fluctuating. Prices went up by a couple dollars. And so even if you raise a gasoline at the pump by 40, 50, 60, 70 cents, that's background noise compared to what we've had recently. And so you don't create that kind of signal. We look at other examples where carbon taxes failed, when large areas were given exemptions, agriculture one, but even in the motor vehicle space as well. And so we need to think about that as well. And the final thing is, and this is very important to remember when you're thinking about batteries, for most people, energy consumption is non-discretionary. They don't have a choice. I interviewed the chief, researcher in Germany, and he described his own situation where he wanted to move to a new apartment so he could have more efficiency and move to heat pumps, but he's renting and there's no empty apartments in Berlin. And so many people who get hit with a carbon tax actually can't change their behavior. And so it never gets to be the kind of signal that you guys would want in the battery position. So that's the bad news. The better news is perhaps what we know about now in the, the last thing I want to say was the political consequences for politicians who tried to raise taxes high. When the French President Macron did so in 2018, there was massive rioting in the streets. 4 people died and they backed off. So you have to realize that there's a political downside to putting carbon tax. And that's why I'm such a big believer in incentives. The first serious attempt to incentivize renewable energy and subsequently batteries is the United States, and that's Jimmy Carter in 1977. Carter was the first person who recognized that we've been subsidizing the fossil fuel industry for many, many years, and it might be a good idea to do something with solar. Now, at that time, photovoltaics was crazy expensive and was really very nascent, but passive solar for water heating was already cost effective. And so he gave taxpayers 40% off the first $1,000 they spent on solar equipment. And he even put solar panels on the White House roof and encouraged states to start encouraging people. I know as a child, I was growing up in North Carolina, my father bought in and we built a solar heating system that heated the water generally fairly well. And he got his little $1,000 incentive. The trouble is that by 1980, there was a new president called Ronald Reagan, and he thought this was sort of a silly program. And not only did he freeze, he didn't cancel these incentives, but he didn't do anything with them. He didn't increase them, expand as they were. And he unceremoniously took down all of the solar panels off the White House roof. Parenthetically, I might add, 2014, we had a shift. Barack Obama brings back photovoltaics, and I think even now batteries on the White House roof, which is now a carbon neutral building. And this is important symbolically. But the story I want to tell you actually takes place in 2006 in California, where a gentleman by the name of David Arfin was just finished business school at Stanford, and he went to see a movie called An Inconvenient Truth, which is Al Gore's very, very disconcerting vision of the future. And he came out and he said, I want to do something for solar. So he looked and he said, geez, it's $40,000 to put a solar system on my roof. I can get a $2,000 tax exemption on it. For me to pay it back at that point would take me about 30 years. Basically, it's a donation. I might as well buy a ecological hotspot in Costa Rica if I'm going to make an ecological donation. But then he started digging through the tax code and realized that although individuals could only take off $2,000, there was no corporate tax cap. And in fact, at that time, Governor Schwarzenegger from California was giving very generous grants. And so he went to a company called Solar City, which was run by a couple of cousins of Elon Musk. And he said, let's come in as third parties and create what we now know as community solar. And going door to door within a very short time, they managed to have about, something like 2 million. Within 3 years, they had 2 million rooftop systems working, and a new business model was created. A business model which was shifted, I think you all know, in California recently, when they shifted the tariff. And I just want to say a word or two about tariffs, and then we'll sort of move it more to conversation. But what happened with feed-in tariffs, it was a German innovation, largely. After the trauma of Chernobyl, all of a sudden, the German dependence on nuclear energy seemed very, very tenuous. And a new party was formed called the Green Party, which ran on an anti-nuclear position. And at the end of the 1990s, they got enough votes, only 7%, but to make the coalition need them to close out. And so they said, well, what do you want? They said, we want 100,000 photovoltaic roofs. That's what we want. And Germany said, that's it. So they passed this thing, and within 4 years, they had 130,000 photovoltaic roofs, and the price of solar began to crash. We all know Swanson's law. What happens every time you double solar power, the price tag went down 20%. And then years later, we would see the same thing happening in terms of the learning curve for batteries. So when we look at solar policy, certainly what you want to think about is how are you going to incentivize it? I look to California as a model of success. You know, the notion that you pay you get about 15 cents for a kilowatt hour during the day for your solar power. But if you can sell back to the grid at 6 p.m., you'll get $2. And nowadays, nobody's going to buy a solar system without a battery. And those are the kind of policies we're going to need across the board. And when Volta and other advocates for the battery industry think about it, those are kind of policies that should be national policies, so that we can, and every state should do it, so that we can really start to talk about decarbonizing the grid. It's not going to happen unless we have batteries cheaper and more mandatory there. And just to wrap up, I would say that the latest trend that I identify looking around the world is command and control. In other words, in Clean Air Act, people were not told whether they wanted to or incentivized to have a catalytic converter. Congress ruled, thou shalt have catalytic converters, you should have clean your air, and that's what they did. This is starting to happen around the world in terms of requiring people to put photovoltaic systems on rooftops, on buildings, commercial buildings first, then residential ones. Tokyo, for example, now has a requirement. I know Israel's starting to make that requirement as well. And now parking lots. French law, which says 50% of parking lots need to be covered with photovoltaics, is the kind of thing we need to do to really drive these technologies, and batteries must be a part of that. So I'm going to stop here and see if there's any questions or discussion, because I know that we like to do that in the Volta gatherings in the battery forum, to try to move it to a discussion as quick as possible. I see Anna smiling because that was what we were coached to do. So this is a sort of an opportunity. We're a small group. So I'd be interested to hear anybody's thoughts on these topics, questions, comments. Anybody want to start? Mark, you're from MIT. What do you have to say?
Well, I mean, I'm on a group called MIT Alumni for Climate Action, and they're trying to very objectively look at all the variables with, some biases too, and try to understand how everything fits in. I've only been participating for a little while, but there's a lot involved with grid storage, as you say, and you could use more pumped hydro, for an example, which is very efficient and could store for a long time, very economically, but only in very few locations. So, and then geothermal can work. It's moderately expensive, but it's okay. Only in certain, like Western US, not in the East whatsoever. As far as deep geothermal energy, geysers works fine in California. It'll work great parts of Alaska where there's volcanoes, and Hawaii. But so you're going to need a mixture. And then you have to have more grid too. There's a company I follow, Earth Grid, that's plasma boring tunnels. I don't know if that'll ever be economical or not, but you have to have ways to not get bogged down in the permitting if it takes 10 years to put in the grid for the wind and solar to go. Yeah.
So the challenge, I think, is when you think about this is, okay, how are we going to create policies to create that variety on the menu and to make it economically viable? And I think that's really needs to be the goal now, because at this point, you're looking at countries. I'm very concerned. I read a whole chapter in this book about scaling to the global south. And there's absolutely no reason why those guys should have sunk costs in fossil fuel, coal plants, whatever. And most of them understand the logic of mini grids and using the advantages and, of course, the cheapest energy possible. But unless you can provide them with a 24/7 solution. So I think part of the problem needs to be that the international agencies that need to be helping, I think America will find its way and get to those technologies on their own. I think we've crossed a tipping point. But I think the international agencies like the World Bank and the IMF that it should be helping developing countries be part of this energy transition have not seen energy storage as such a central part of their agenda, and that's something which I think could change, and I think it requires that.
And so there's the carrot and the stick, and you'd like to, taxing things for CO2 use, and hopefully not sequestering it, because you'd rather just not form it, can help a lot. But
sure, yeah. Richard's unable to speak, as I recall. Mr. Childers, do you have a comment you'd like to share with us, or thoughts?
I'm just really interested how this is all going to kind of tie into AI, quite frankly. There's a lot of advancement stuff with regards to, I think, Alphabet, Google. They did a lot of stuff with material research that they put forth. And not just that aspect of it, that's an amazing aspect, but also this concept of AI being able to provide people with an avenue of trust and a path, right? Because there's a lot of people that know simply like, oh, well, solar panel is good, but they hear one little snippet of something good or bad, and it really drives their whole decision-making process. because their ability to get information from point A to point B. And I look at this idea of, being able to have a trusted breadcrumb trail to follow and to project manage and help you through these sort of things that can, once you get some of these things in place, it can really accelerate and stabilize a lot of new ideas and inventions, the adoption curve, if you will.
Yeah.
A lot more.
Well, the
things
problem is that there's no trust in the U.S. There's no trust because our government changes every 4 years, and it's going to change in a year or less, and it's going to be dramatic, and we can't predict. So it's totally unpredictable.
We can only hope that the Green New Deal in Europe is far enough along. And to be honest, the fact that most of the money from the IRA grants and the like and the Infrastructure Act, 78% of them are in congressional districts, which are red districts, which are Republican districts. And so hopefully this will create at least in the energy space, would create a bipartisan. How do you guys see this, Michael, in terms of your work?
I'm curious to hear if you have any examples of previous efforts in moving towards the energy transition for a bipartisan government, and how those policies were able to circumvent the traditional headbutting that you see in these bipartisan.
That's a good question. The first course I ever taught on climate policy was in New Zealand, of all places, at the University of Otago. And in 2003, if you would believe it, they were actually trying to put a carbon tax. And the problem was that New Zealand's emissions profile is fairly idiosyncratic. It's over 50% livestock. It's sheep and cows to a lesser extent. And so they said, okay, if that's where the emissions are, let's put a carbon tax on them as well. And I wouldn't call it exactly like the American insurrection that happened on January 6th, but literally the farmers of New Zealand drove their tractors to the steps of the Capitol building and to tell the people, we don't want to have to be in this competitive disadvantage. It's hard enough to sell butter and ship it halfway around the world and lamb and whatever they export. And the government backed down. And that's what I started to say about this problem of the carbon taxes. One of the ways to get around it, I think, and it's much more popular usually, is actually just by good old-fashioned regulation. I'll give you some examples. It's hard for us even to remember that there used to be this thing called incandescent light bulbs, okay? But when the LED batteries became so much less expensive and so much more efficient, 2007, Australia said, okay, 2 years from now, there'll be no more LED lighting. And the surgeons went ballistic and complained how we can do operations. Okay, they made that small concession. But in the end of the day, nobody today in Australia misses that. And in 2011, it was the EU and then several other countries. And by now, well over 50% of the lighting in the world comes from LED. The percentage of the electricity that goes to lighting globally has dropped as lighting has expanded dramatically. And so that's an example. You have other ones. I know in Israel, there was a requirement for solar panels years ago, and it didn't, because it was not something that was a tax. It was just telling an industry, these are things you have to do. And so I see that happening. We could do the same thing with heat pumps today. We could certainly do the same thing for batteries. We could mandate it. All new buildings need to provide photovoltaics and storage systems. And I think by doing that, you would, and because now that is the cheapest form of energy and nobody would argue with the prices, that'd be much more effective than putting taxes, because taxes are a red flag to many people. People work hard for their money, and there's an ideological divide about whether that's so much taxes is an appropriate government role. So by hitting an industry, which is, there's a lot of interesting things happening in plastics. Just tell people these are the kinds of plastics you need to use from now on. This is how you're going to manufacture cement. It means that, in fact, there'll be a higher price initially, but eventually the price will go down. And I think that's a much easier way to finesse the political sensitivities. What do you think, Sia? Yeah, let's get you on the...
Yeah. Alon, I have... not quite a devil's advocate point of view, but
right ahead.
maybe contrarian to this group. So as you can imagine, I participate in a lot of conversations about policy, about how to increase adoption.
Right.
One thing that always bugs me about not talking some topic is this lack of inclusion about how do we communicate to the 50% of the population that don't agree that climate change is an issue. And from the point of view of Volta Foundation, having wider adoption for batteries is good for everyone. It's just that people care about different things, and I think maybe we can do a better job in communicating to the public about the benefits of the technology. Things like maybe EVs are just better cars, lower maintenance, they're cleaner, they're better for cleaner air. I think that's a bipartisan. Everybody's for cleaner air. Having a domestic supply chain for batteries means jobs for everybody, and I think those are kind of things that maybe more people can get behind than maybe sort of more prescriptive policies that gets people angry about big government.
Yeah, I think that's an issue that I think one of the most interesting things to me is that there's something policy called renewable portfolio standards, which people tend to forget were one of the most important. The renewable portfolio standard, first state to do that, to adopt one, was Iowa. Not exactly a Silicon Valley, Vermont, uber liberal kind of ecosystem there, but the second income stream that wind turbines would provide for the farmers of Iowa, and now to some extent batteries, the solar as well, but mostly was wind there. The governor was convinced on the merits that this was something that they could do, and they started requiring all utilities to start with 10% and raising it. Look at Texas today, which produces more wind energy than anybody else, and that's certainly a conservative state. And I don't think that people's attitude towards climate change there, although they should be, given what's happened in Houston the last week or two, and then the high temperatures that my brother lives in Austin, so I can tell you it's really hot there in the summertime. But I think until that time, today, thank goodness, I think it largely thanks to the Germans who really raised their to pay. That's the thing about when you make these kind of incentive programs and subsidize, electricity bills goes way up. So they pay about 32 euros for a kilowatt hour. About, I thought it's 4 times more than they pay in North Carolina. I was just checking it for my sister who lives in North Carolina. But by doing that, and by those good, not taxpayers, but the customers of the utilities in Germany, they drove down the price, and then all of a sudden you could make the case that we should require this. And so many states, and they've done studies now of states that have a requirement for certain percentage of renewables as not, and it just is better for certain kinds of constituents. And the fact that all the big battery plants that have been set up, South Carolina, Alabama, the like, these are really important, I think, statements. But I agree with you that if we stay in an echo chamber, and especially the way the political map is looking at present, has to be a much broader sense of this. And the metaphor of warfare, what happened after Pearl Harbor, and how all Americans got together to make the war effort and victory gardens, and that's what we need to in climate. We're not there, and there has been I think a failure. Now, if with all due respect, this was not coincidence. There's if you read the book Merchants of Doubt, you can see the fossil fuel industry was somewhat disingenuous in funding the bogus research and the lobbyists, and so it was a hard battle. But all the same, I just finished writing an article as an academic about the psychology of climate denial, and it's there's a whole research there, and I don't want to give you the whole lecture here now, but the fact of the matter is there's lots of different ways that you can message even climate, but not even talking about the economic benefits of renewables, that would be somewhat more effective, and they've seen it in focus groups. So I think we need to speak truth, but I don't think we need to listen to people. We need to be a little bit less, condescending and the like. The truth of the matter is also something very, very generational. This would be an interesting fact for you all. The Pew group did a study on who willing to buy electric cars amongst Republicans versus Democrats. So Republicans over the age of 65, it's like 10 or 15%. You're not going to get that market. But younger Republicans are more open to this message. And that also might be something for those companies that are working in that space to reach out to those kind of people as well. We don't have a lot of time left, I see. So, we've ended. So it was great meeting with you all. And again, the book is called Making Climate Tech Work. It's much more interesting than this lecture. And especially if you have problems with insomnia, you can buy it, and in 2 pages will do it. Thanks so much to the Volta Foundation, to Michael and Yen for including me in their wonderful battery forum.
There's a link in the chat.